I woke up this morning and, like many of you, I reached for my phone. But before I checked my email or my social media, I checked the number on a website. It was $5.50, down 25 cents. This number is my share price, and it's not on any index you've heard of, it's not in an investment app, and it's not part of the blockchain. In 2008, I launched my own exchange so people could buy and sell shares of me. Not in my company, but in me, the person. Like any market, you can try to buy low and sell high, book a profit, but holding shares gives you something else: influence. Because shareholders vote on my life experiences, and the more shares you have, the more power. When I'm struggling with something, my shareholders help provide clarity. They vote on a variety of issues, everything from what I wear to who I vote for. And just as an example, let's take a look at my last vote. I recently spent the night in an old bed and breakfast in Mississippi that dates back to 1897. I woke up in the middle of the night, and I saw the shape of a woman in my room, and I was startled, disconcerted, but I told myself it's just like a towel or something catching the light. But I kept seeing her, and I was alone in the dark, and I started to feel really panicked and scared. In the morning, there was nothing there, but also like no towel or nothing that would have made that shape. So what did I see? Well, having shareholders lets me gain some clarity on this. I asked them, do I believe in ghosts? Now, just the act of writing up a shareholder question is therapeutic. It's basically an essay describing what I'm struggling with and why it matters to me. And I try to express the problem in the least biased way that I can. And that allows my community to come in and act with the wisdom of the crowd and offer me the best possible answer. In this case, I wrote a long, detailed story about everything I could remember, and they voted. So I believe in ghosts, which makes sense to me because, I really was scared of something. So it must have been a ghost. And obviously, this is a unique way to decide on a system of beliefs or even a course of action. Why would anyone want to trust a group of strangers this much? What makes me value my community so much that I'm on stage saying I believe in ghosts? And I think it's because I grew up mostly alone in Coldfoot, Alaska. Coldfoot is this tiny dot on the map, 60 miles north of the Arctic Circle. The population is 10. I had more interactions with moose than humans for the majority of my childhood. We moved when I was about 11 to an actual town where I could have actual human friends, but I had no idea how to interact with other kids. I didn't know how to make or even really be a friend. I eventually made a few friends on the swim team and a couple more in the debate club, and it gave me this idea that friendship is what happens when you're doing something together with someone. But doing things with people is harder after you leave the structure of school, and I moved to Portland, Oregon, and found myself wanting to be friends with writers and musicians and artists. I think because they're asking the question of how to be, and the point of any art is sort of to ask that question without really expecting an answer. And I wanted to ask that question, but I wasn't an artist, and I didn't really have any way of interacting with them. Then I got an email that gave me an idea. It was Warren Buffett's famous annual letter to his stockholders, where he talks about his company, Berkshire Hathaway, and all the investments that he's made and successes and downfalls. But I didn't want to be the famous investor. I wanted to be the beloved and valuable company. And so that's when I built my own exchange, divided myself up into shares, and I listed them at just $1 each. I wasn't greedy. And invited people to invest. A few friends became shareholders. I tentatively started to post questions. And after a while, my share price doubled to $2 a share. Artists and writers and musicians that I knew were buying the shares and voting, and I thought it worked. I'd ask the question, is this a way to be? And the answer was yes. So then I decided to ask for help with my first really personal decision. I'd been wrestling with this idea, should I get a vasectomy? And so after a bit of discussion, the vote ended, no. And I was relieved because I was a little nervous about the procedure, but also because, like the ghost question, it gave me certainty. I didn't have to wrestle with it anymore. It was a problem that was now solved. My girlfriend got pretty upset, though, because we were pretty serious, we lived together, and we'd been talking about this issue. She was also a shareholder, so I just assumed she'd vote. But the whole thing made her feel pretty exposed because she saw this as a vote about us, about like our potential kids. And that not everyone prefers certainty over privacy. That's fair. We eventually did break up, and I realized I had treated her more as a friend than a romantic partner. So I ignored romantic relationships. I had clarity in being a publicly traded person, and so I just focused on my new friends, the shareholders. I created votes for self-improvement and for the larger community. To let them get to know me on a deeper level, I asked them if I should share my genetic data. There were some privacy concerns, but they said yes. To make myself more attractive, I asked if I could spend 3 months just dedicated, nothing else, just I want to become incredibly fit. They said no. They said that would be vain and a waste of my time. As my shareholders started to feel more like my extended family, I asked them if I should pay out my life insurance policy to them. And they love that idea. At this point, I think I'd gone about a year without dating anyone. But with the structure that I had for my shareholders, I was feeling more self-confident, and I realized I wanted a relationship, a real romantic partner, not just another friend. But I also knew I had to be intentional and not fall into those old patterns. I needed accountability, and I thought the invisible hand of the shareholders could help. So I asked them, will you help me? As you can imagine, they agreed. Voting 86% yes, including my ex-girlfriend. So I created a special website for the Romance Project. Only those with shares would be given access. I gave pseudonyms to everyone I went on a date with. No photos were posted. And this allowed me to write up honest reports of the dates, just like I'd written the shareholder questions. But it was also much harder than the shareholder questions because I had to talk about my feelings and not just the objective data. And I'd never really paid attention to my feelings. And then I met Agassi. She was a few years younger than me, intelligent, competent, hardworking, adventurous. She had this serious but beautiful face. She just recently started working at a hedge fund. I was like, oh my God, she works in finance. She was also artistic. I was fascinated and honestly a little worried she was out of my league. So I asked her out for oysters and champagne, classic first date. But writing up the post-date reports with Agassi was much easier. I had very strong feelings right away, and it was exciting. And as a result of my enthusiastic reports, she got high marks from the shareholders. The best part was she loved this project. She bought shares, which gave her a login to the Romance Project, which was a little weird, because now she was reading all of the things that I'd written. And then she admitted to voting herself up and everyone else down. An aggressively romantic move. And that was when I knew she liked me, I knew she liked playing this game with me, and it was clear that she was the one we were looking for. So we negotiated a mutually exclusive relationship contract. It detailed out all of our needs, and we designed worksheets to track our dates, our social obligations, how often we had sex. Violations resulted in financial penalties. All of this was reviewed by the shareholders. And we were just having so much fun, and I was falling in love with her, and so were my shareholders. It was also an unusual love story, and it was fun to talk about. And then from that came the press, which felt honestly really gratifying. Like, it was a validation of what was like at first glance, an incredibly strange way of asking questions about human loneliness, but then wrapped up in this heartwarming and romantic story. And I turned into a little bit of a local celebrity. And then I was invited on the Today Show, the longest running TV show in America. They sent a production crew out and they followed us around for a day. And we flew to New York and I went on live television to talk about my relationship to millions of viewers. My shareholders back home gathered at this dive bar early in the morning to watch as I talked about how everything worked, how it was a collaboration between me and the shareholders, and how it had changed my life. It taught me to talk about my feelings, my problems, my hopes. The whole thing made me feel like it was okay to be a weirdo. Like this strange little kid from Alaska had found his people. After the show aired, the number of shareholders exploded. It was like hundreds of shareholders came in and then hundreds more. My share price shot up past $20 a share. My brother cashed out and bought a dishwasher. There were so many shareholders now, I felt like I was in charge of an army. It got so big that a Hollywood studio optioned my life rights, and it was announced that Jason Bateman was going to play the role of Mike Merrill, the world's publicly traded person. And my shareholders were even more excited than I was, and we joked about what they were going to force me to wear to the premiere. The problem was, the majority of my shareholders were now total strangers, and I started to feel really obsessed with the share price. It was the only measure that I had about how much they cared. So I became reluctant to mention any bad news. Like when the Jason Bateman movie faded away, I made no mention of it. And then Agassi suffered a terrible family loss. And I tried to support her, but as comfortable as I'd become performing my feelings to this group of people online, like processing actual pain in our relationship with this very important person, I didn't really know how to do that. And she could tell that I was just kind of waiting for the pain to be over so we could get back to normal. But things had changed for her and not for me. So she pulled away, and then feeling rejected, I pulled away. I didn't share any of this. It was too personal, too private. And there were other problems going on in my life. The startup I'd co-founded ran into hard times, and I stopped paying myself. And I didn't want to mention that because as the human embodiment of capitalism, I didn't want to say I was bad at business. So instead, I just projected that everything was going fine for the publicly traded person. Even though inside I was wondering if my relationship would survive, if my business was going to fail. And while I had these hundreds and hundreds of people literally invested in my life, I refused to talk about it with anyone. And there was a bit of a lull, and nothing much was happening. And then the press came back, specifically Playboy magazine. They wanted to run a feature about the fascinating life of the publicly traded person. And things had kind of smoothed out at this point with Agassi. And I had this idea. I knew how to fix everything. I wrote up the proposal. I asked the shareholders to end control of my romantic life because I was going to ask Agassi to marry me. I detailed the amazing history of our relationship and flattered all of the shareholder involvement along the way. And I hid from them every problem and any doubts that I had. So, of course, it passed with 99% approval. They loved us together. And I was thinking, this is like a classic corporate turnaround. Yes, I'm still hiding some of the ugly parts from them, but this wrapped up the romance story in such a perfect way. It was like a storybook ending. Plus, there was new press, and that would keep the community excited, which would keep the stock price up. And I thought, once things are a little more stable, I can get back to a more honest place with my shareholders. I was in control again. And to show off to the Playboy writer, I surveyed my shareholders to get an approval rating of the project. That did not go as I expected. And my approval rating came in at 34%. And these were not anonymous votes. The people voting no are not just my biggest shareholders, but they were some of my closest friends. And they detailed in the comments about how the recent votes were dull and my communication had become impersonal and detached. They listed all the projects and votes that I hadn't finished, and even Agassi had voted no. And initially I felt ashamed, like they'd caught me in a lie, but as I thought about it, I got angry because I'd put everything into this. Like, all they had to do was show up and vote. I was so focused on the share price that I let everything else in my life slide. At the point when Agassi needed me most, I wasn't there for her, and not just my relationship, but my finances. I'd taken on credit card debt. I was sacrificing everything, and then they suddenly decided I was a bad investment. It's the only time I've ever thought about just shutting the whole project down. And then things kept deteriorating with Agassi. It got so bad that I moved into the detached studio that we had behind the house. And when I even just thought about going into this home that we owned together, like I couldn't breathe. So I moved back in with my parents, and it was like worse than cold foot, because now I was alone, but it was all my fault. Eventually, I reached out to Marcus, who was one of my first shareholders and also a close friend, and I needed the friend part and not the shareholder. I needed to talk to someone about the hard things. He pointed out, rather bluntly, that I had broken my own rules, and I said I had protected the share price. He said, "Your share price or your ego," and I thought it is honestly kind of the same thing. He said if I wanted their help, I needed to kill the fake persona, the ever-optimistic, publicly traded person. And I said that the persona was really all I had left at this point. And he pointed out, look where that's gotten you. So with great reluctance, I tried a little bit of honesty. I put up a vote explaining that I had serious credit card debt, and I wanted to work with a shareholder who was a financial coach, and it was approved. So then I admitted that I was unemployed, and I offered a 100-share bounty to anyone who referred me to a job. And some friends in Los Angeles pointed me to an opportunity, and I flew out for an interview. I tried to declare project bankruptcy to wipe the slate clean. That was rejected, so I rewrote it as a project reorganization to manage the workload, and that passed with 98% approval. And then I moved to Los Angeles. I took a new job, and suddenly I had small but real decisions to make again. Like, should my first paycheck go towards buying a mattress or getting the internet? Should I start meditating? Should I root for the Dodgers? Meanwhile, over 1,000 miles away from Agassi, it was clear that the relationship was over, but I still didn't want to tell my shareholders. The romance project had been the most successful part of being a publicly traded person. It had made me a little bit famous, and it's part of the reason I'm here. Plus, it's embarrassing, and it feels like kind of a failure of character to admit that I was engaged and then it all fell apart. But Agassi was moving on and didn't want to be a shareholder anymore. She wanted to cash out of her shares. So we agreed to end our relationship in the spirit that we had started it, with one final vote. A mutual release and non-disparagement agreement. I would sign it if the shareholders voted yes, and she would sign it if the shareholders bought her out of her shares. It was a vote to take us full circle, not the storybook ending, but a truthful one. But she, one final wrench, she wanted more than the current fair market price for her shares. So I had to open up. I told my shareholders that our breakup was a long time coming and I had resisted it. I told them about how I had held tight to this lie that everything was going fine and that now I had a real favor to ask. I asked them not to act in their own self-interest, but in mine, and buy out her shares at a premium. And there's very little discussion on this vote. Just one shareholder saying, I bought a share, and another commenting, I bought a few. And it kind of felt like that scene when everyone stands up and says, I am Spartacus, but instead they were saying, I am a shareholder. And they bought her shares within moments. And the vote was 98% yes. And after that, I realized how truly incredible it is to have shareholders. And I started to reframe the project. Instead of presenting my annual report to them, I created a shareholder conference where they gave presentations. During the pandemic, we started a shareholder poker game, and it still meets every week. Sometimes I don't even show up. I just completed a shareholder roadshow across North America where I was just meeting shareholders. And I didn't make it a project or a podcast or anything. I just an opportunity to hang out and get to know each other. Today I have 1,128 shareholders, and the persona of the publicly traded person, the character who only wore Brooks Brothers and was an exceptional success, is over. The publicly traded person is now just me. Anyone can become a shareholder, and even if they sell off all their shares, we can still be friends. Going forward, there will still be votes that are a little boring, because sometimes I struggle with boring things. There will be votes about new projects, self-improvement, what to believe, and probably for the rest of my life, I'll wake up and I'll check the share price. I'll get a little jolt of energy when it's up, and I'll feel a little bummed when it's down. But it is like having a superpower. It means as long as I'm honest, I never have to be alone. I have a group of friends and strangers to share the ups and especially the downs of my life. A place to talk about feeling lonely, about being excited, and figuring out with the shareholders what comes next. Thank you.